Great, guys. Welcome, everybody. We're super excited to have you here talking about relationship violence amongst COVID-19. I know this has been something we've all heard a lot about, and we're super honored to have Jessica Yaffa here with us as one of the co-presenters. She is a relationship coach, speaker, trainer, and senior advisor over at Doyen Consulting firm. So thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. From the dorm side, we have my partner, Dr. Amanda Fialk. She is our chief of clinical and will be one of the co-presenters today with Jessica. She oversees clinical in both our New York and DC campuses, as well as Sarah Harte, who is our Washington, DC director, and she will be manning the Q&A. So just real quick, as far as housekeeping, we'll be doing a PowerPoint presentation. Typically, it's about 35 to 40 minutes. It's a relatively small group today, so certainly if you have any questions that come up during the PowerPoint presentation, please go ahead and use the chat box. If not, certainly there'll be ample time for a Q&A following that. We'll go ahead and follow up with an email to everybody, so you have all of our personal contacts following this, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So with that, if I can ask Meredith to queue up the slides, and I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John, and thank you to the rest of the dorm team. Thrilled to be here and to be a part of this conversation with all of you this afternoon. And thank you to those of you that are joining us for the conversation from wherever it is that you may be. Really grateful that you felt like this was a topic that was important enough to take some time out of your day to participate in. So looking forward to hearing your feedback and questions as we move toward the end of the presentation. Anytime I have a conversation like this around the topic of relationship violence, I like to always start by acknowledging that not only has my professional life really been surrounding the topic of healthy relationships and relationship violence for the last many, many years, but that what has driven me into this particular area of work is my own personal experience. And so feels really important this afternoon as we start off for me to acknowledge that it's my hope that we have an opportunity to talk collectively this afternoon, not just about how it is that we are impacted as professionals, but also really acknowledging that many of us have personal experience and connection to this topic. And we have an opportunity potentially to make a difference in the way in which we're talking about this topic, not just in our professional lives with our clients, but also with our children, our friends, our neighbors, our partners, extended family, etc. So I come to you as a professional with now close to 20 years of experience working in this field, and also a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. My first husband's actually serving a 29-year prison sentence. He's been incarcerated since 2001. And our son was 4.5 at the time when his dad went away to prison. He's now 23. And so as you can imagine, not only have I had my own journey around healing from the effects of trauma and rebuilding identity, but he has also had his own journey. And so happy to, as we move forward in the conversation today, and as we get to the place where there's an opportunity for questions and answers, happy to share, not just as a professional who's doing this work, but also to share perspective of a survivor, as well as perspective of a parent who is now sort of navigating alongside her adult child, his journey around being a child survivor. So, when we talk about sort of the significance or the gravity of the impact of relationship violence, many of us on this screen are much more aware than the general public or population about the magnitude of people affected. And yet I think super important that we start off by just really remembering that when we're talking about relationship violence, we're really talking about 1/3 of our society, of our world being impacted. And in fact, more than that in certain places in our world. 1/3 of women have experienced some form of relationship violence or will experience some form of relationship violence in their lifetime. And current statistics actually tell us that about 1 in 7 men will experience some form of relationship violence in their lifetime. And when we look at LGBTQ community, the rates are of course higher for a lot of different reasons. And the impact that relationship violence is having on certain communities, including the LGBTQ community, is also very significant. When we think about relationship violence, I think it's really important that we acknowledge, and again, this is not going to be news to anyone and yet really offers us some context around today's conversation, that what we're talking about is something that is bred in the need for power and control, right? And the way in which we access power and control over another happens in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forms, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And yet, when I think about the significant impact that COVID-19 is having on relationship violence and those that are affected, and think about this power and control dynamic being sort of the foundation of what breeds relationship violence, I can't help but think about the fact that when we are in an environment where there is further isolation from friends, families, colleagues, daycare environments, etc., that the incidents of domestic violence or relationship violence are not going to only become much more plentiful, but also much more significant in nature. So those who are or have already experienced relationship violence, being in lockdown or being in shelter in place is going to only exacerbate the situations that have already or are already occurring. And then I think, again, just to the point that the last bullet makes, the idea that further isolation, feelings of loss of control for the harm doer who is looking for a sense of power and control and feeling very out of power, or a loss of sense of power, as well as things like financial insecurity, issues around parenting, additional stressors on the relationship because of the amount of time spent with one another, etc., that ultimately this just magnifies an epidemic really that already existed prior to the pandemic occurring. So when we think about the idea that domestic violence is bred in this absolute desperation for power and control, and we think about the way in which a harm doer becomes activated in that sense of loss of power or control, it becomes pretty obvious as to why incidents are increasing and why the severity of the incidents are becoming much, much bigger. So we have people who are sick. We have people who are afraid of becoming sick. We have people who are afraid of infecting others, which increases, again, feelings of isolation. Financial stress is actually one of the primary stressors that we know is directly attached to increased incidents of relationship violence or relationship abuse. And so for those of you, I imagine all of us are aware of the significant impact that COVID-19 is having on so many of us economically. We can only sort of draw the conclusion that that financial stress is significantly impacting families that are already in a volatile situation where any feelings of loss of control or shift in a power dynamic even is going to create additional rupture. When we think about not only there being financial stress around potentially the harm doer losing their job or decreasing hours, and that being a stressor on the family, which ultimately can increase incidents of relationship violence, we also need to think about the fact that sometimes a harm doer has lost their job and the survivor or the victim of relationship violence is still working. And so then there's a change in the power dynamic, right? Which a harm doer doesn't really know what to do with. Now I am reliant on my partner who I have had control over to provide for our family in this way, which creates even sort of further feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, loss of control, etc. And then again, we also know that parenting, for those of us who are parents, we also know that parenting, for all of the beauty that exists in and around the raising of our children, parenting is a significant stressor, especially on a relationship where there isn't a fundamental foundation of safety and security. And so now we have kids in the home 24 hours a day. We're responsible for teaching those kids, and ultimately a harm doer is going to have very different ideas of what that needs to look like, right? Than ultimately the victim or survivor may. And so there's a lot of opportunity for conflict in a way that increases the likelihood of danger in the household, in the system. And then lastly, this idea of the connection between substance use and relational violence being one that absolutely needs to be looked at. The latest statistic that I have been privy to is that in incidents of intimate partner violence, one or both parties is under the influence of some sort of substance 60 to 70% of the time. And so if we know that substance use is increasing as a result of the stressors that are existing in our world, and we know that there's this connection between substance use and the increase in incidents surrounding relationship violence, the two together really become a recipe for disaster. So I think really important to acknowledge how and why not only there are additional incidents of relational violence happening in our country. And to speak to that for a moment, I will just throw out there that I was just doing some research this morning prior to our coming together around the rate in which incidents of physical violence have increased. And in certain parts of our country, calls to police departments and the domestic violence hotlines are up as much as 33% since the middle of March. California, which is where I am, San Diego specifically, is up somewhere between 4 and 7%. So it's really varying in different parts of our country. And yet, if we consider that, let's say in San Diego, for example, we're getting somewhere around 18,000 calls a year, and we estimate that that's about 10% of what's actually happening. 10% of these cases are reported, and we increase that somewhere between 5 and 35%. That's really significant. And so important to recognize and understand that that's not even representative necessarily of the number of incidents that are occurring, right? Because survivors are unable to find the time or space to actually reach out to a lot of our local community resources. Often they are unable to reach out to police departments or the domestic violence hotline. They're being monitored more closely than ever. They don't have a moment to themselves. They don't have these safe spaces that have been approved places to go, right? So oftentimes a harm doer will allow a survivor to take their children to and from school or to go to work, even if they're the one that is dropping them off and picking them up. Maybe they're approved to go to a faith-based service or a woman's event on a Wednesday evening. Maybe they're able to go to and from daycare, and those moments in time where those spaces become the safe space in order to be able to reach out and access support. And yet for many survivors, those spaces have disappeared. And so again, not only is it about the fact that resources have become a little bit more limited, it's really about survivors not having free moment or space to access services, and the likelihood of surveillance as a harm doer is feeling more and more out of control and becoming more and more desperate to feel like they have power and control. They're going to go to further lengths to ensure that they're in control in whatever ways they need. And so additional surveillance and heightened awareness of what their partner's doing, who they're talking to, where they are in the house, et cetera, is going to increase. So when we talk about not only the fact that survivors are struggling to be able to access support and resources, I think also super imperative that we acknowledge that the resources themselves have been limited. There are many resources around the country that have sort of been the hub of support or resource for a survivor in crisis that have closed completely, or are no longer taking walk-in hours, that have very limited availability, that have certain parts of their agency open, but not other parts. And so ultimately, not only is the accessing of resources difficult, but the resources themselves actually have become much less available and have decreased significantly. And as resources and services start to open up, we also know that they're being inundated by an amount of need that they're unable to meet. So that both of these issues exist, right? That they've been closed or limited, and as they open, they're unable to meet the inundation of need that is starting to come forward. In addition, when we sort of think about the way that COVID is impacting survivors in their comfort level in reaching out to resources that are available and that do exist, I think two things. One being that ultimately there's this risk of them getting sick, them exposing their children, and or they're fearing that they may get someone else sick. And so the idea of accessing emergency services where they're in a shelter with strangers who may or may not be exposed and or infected, they're not sure if they or their children have been exposed or infected. That just causes sort of another layer of concern. And in addition, seeking emergency medical services is often followed by access to resources, right? So typically when a survivor walks into an emergency room or calls the police, he or she has immediate access to local resources in order to then move into a space of safety and support. Well, if those resources are limited or not available at all, as a survivor, I'm certainly not going to seek emergency support, knowing that there's not going to be a resource to meet me on the other end of that. And ultimately now I'm in more danger than ever before, having sought emergency support. And then lastly, the way in which support is often accessed is not necessarily through the direct reaching out of the survivor, right? It may be a teacher reporting mysterious injuries on one of their students. It may be a human resource department or an employer asking questions about why a survivor has missed several days of work, or odd bruises that are appearing, or the fact that he or she is attached to their phone constantly and they're overhearing a lot of to evaluate in the same way that we have or are able to when we're in person. And therefore these sort of the safety buffers that survivors have around really trusting others to see us in a way that maybe we don't have the ability to seek out support around also becomes limited or non-existent. So I think it feels important to me to acknowledge a handful of things at this point. Number one, in the first handful of slides, I think we can feel really overwhelmed with, my goodness, this feels hopeless. I feel helpless. What do we do? How do we help? What are the answers, right? And so I think it felt important to me prior to handing it off to Amanda to really acknowledge the opportunity to really speak to a couple of things. Number one, that connection is the most important resource that we're able to provide someone who is experiencing relationship violence of any kind, right? That he or she lives in a world of feeling unworthy, unseen, unvalued, unheard. And the expectation has been, I have to do, be, and perform perfectly in order to be deserving of relationship and connection. And if we can be a space where we show up unconditionally, I'm here to support you no matter what you choose. I'm here to support you no matter what you decide. I'm here to support you without an agenda around the decisions that you make in or around your relationship. I'm here to tell you that you are worthy of connection with me no matter where you are in your life, your process, etc. That begins to allow a survivor a moment to really question the story that they've been living in that has likely existed long before they entered the dangerous relationship, right? So the idea that every moment that we show up from a place of transparency, authenticity, vulnerability, and authentic connection, that we are providing solution, I think is one way that we can feel a little less powerless in sort of the what we can't do. I think another really important point that for me to make that felt really imperative to just acknowledge as we move forward in the presentation is that when we suggest a resource for a survivor based on what we think they need without asking them if they're interested in resources or what it is that they feel like they need, if anything, we are recreating this story of you don't know how to take care of yourself. You don't know what you need. I know better than you, which is also the story that they're operating in, right? Or I better, as a survivor, take you up on this resource that you're suggesting because you now have an expectation or an agenda. And if I disappoint you or I don't follow through, then I become undeserving or unworthy of the relationship. So I'm either going to lie to you or I'm going to stop showing up. And so this idea of resources never being assumed, right, in terms of what a survivor needs is super important. Really asking for their input, in addition to making the request in the first place. Are you interested in resources, and what sorts of resources would feel helpful to you, rather than someone disclosing to us, I'm in an unsafe situation, and are then saying, okay, great, we need to get you out. Now let's move into a safety plan and talk about calling the police, right? Because number one, that absolutely may not be safe. Number two, it may not be where they are in their process. It may not be where they ever are. And number three, we are risking the rupture of potentially one of the only authentic, safe, connected relationships that they have. I think one of the other points that felt important to talk about is when we think about safety planning with our clients in this environment, really important to get creative with them, right? We don't want to decide for them how to keep themselves safe. Number one, that puts us at risk, but number two, that really puts them at risk. So they need to be an active participant in their safety plan. Number two, thinking outside of the box, like if you are on a Zoom video with me each week, is there a particular gesture that you might want to show me so that I know that you're unsafe? And that is an indicator that you need emergency help, right? Whether it's when I ask you how you're doing, if you say A-okay, that's my signal, right? Whatever it is that we're able to do to sort of get creative around how we might be able to provide some additional support, really important. Also talking with our clients about things like, do you have a neighbor in proximity? And if when you are outside for the hour a day that you're allowed playing with your child, might you have an opportunity to say to your neighbor, hey, don't want to go into details, but if you see my outside light flickering more than two times, I need you to call the police. Is there a safe word that you might establish with your children, right? So that if you say this word to your child, they know how to dial 911. Lots of different ways that we can get even more creative, knowing that there are additional restrictions around the windows of time or opportunity that our survivors have in order to access support. It's a really important time also to be thinking about and looking at less obvious signs of abuse. So do you have a partner who wants to be on your Zoom screen with you? Do you have a partner who is wanting to call and check in on the client that you're working with each and every week to talk about progress, et cetera? Our initial response or reaction may be, oh, what a caring partner who is invested in the wellness and healing of their loved one, and yet may also be a partner who's really needing to have and wanting to have control over what's shared, how it's shared, what's not shared, et cetera. Are your clients early to your virtual appointments, or are you struggling to get them off of the screen? Again, some of that may be just a boundary issue. Other parts of that may be, you may be one of their only approved spaces, right? And so are they really holding that space so sacred that they're going to extend it for however long that they can? All opportunities to just ask some additional questions and develop some additional curiosity. And then lastly, we talked about this a little bit in the first point on this slide, and that is that establishing yourself as a safe person. I have no agenda around what you choose to do or not do. I will make no judgment around what you choose to share or not share, and you have the right to change your mind. Whatever it is that you decide in this moment can absolutely be different than what you decide in the next moment, and I'm still here. I think all of those messages are imperative for the survivors that we're working with all the time, and specifically during a time like this. Thank you. I tried to get through a lot in a very short period of time. I'll look forward to any questions or feedback that you have as we move forward. And Amanda, would love to hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. It was such an amazing amount of really powerful and important information. So thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about at the dorm, kind of what we're seeing and how we are addressing relationship violence. coronavirus, COVID-19, presented a really interesting set of circumstances for our young adult clients, because we work specifically with young adults. So for a lot of our clients who were entering young adulthood, they were able to leave either abusive, violent, or non-affirming homes for the first time in their lives. As they turned 18, they were going to school, going to colleges, or just moving out on their own and working. Then COVID-19 hits, and now they have to move back into those homes, the homes that they had been waiting until the clock was ticking down until the second that they could turn 18 and go to college and leave those homes. And now they're back in those homes. And we're continuing to work with them as they are in those homes. So this population in particular, as the pandemic hit, was one that we became very worried about, because not only are they back in these homes, but they're also not able to be in person in treatment as much as they were able to pre-coronavirus. So they're not able to leave the home on a daily basis and be at a place like the dorm where they have support, where they have community, as Jessica said, where they have connection, because the government, it's not safe to leave the home. Everybody is sheltering in place. So we really wanted to try to create a virtual experience that was able to, address these issues that some of our young adult clients were facing as they returned to home environments that that felt very unsafe for them, either mentally, emotionally, or physically. So what we wanted to do, the first thing that we did, and we did this across the board, and what we did was we sent out an email to our entire community, clients and families, saying that we were doing this across the board, where every single one of our clients was going to get, in addition to their daily treatment schedule, which was going to be happening virtually, they were going to get twice a day check-ins by their coach or their therapist. So the person that they really felt the closest connection with, that they trusted the most in their life. And those twice a day check-ins were going to happen at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. This helps us, to give them a point of contact right when they wake up in the morning and right before they go to bed at night, but also allows us to, as much as is possible, be able to be in the home without actually being them. And like Jessica was talking about, allows us to get creative with our clients in helping them to show us what may or may not be going on in the home environment. So the beginning of the day would be just a, wake up, how are you doing? What are your intentions for the day? Let's set a schedule for the day. And then at the end of the day, sort of a taking inventory of the day, what worked today, what could work better tomorrow. And then, a lot of our clients will even allow us to walk around the home with them. So we can be there without being there. Some of our clients, when they're in situations where they're living either with family members who are non-affirming or who are abusive in a variety of different ways, we're struggling to find private spaces within their homes to be able to do therapy, to be able to participate in group sessions. And this was another instance of us really needing to help our clients to find creative spaces, even within the home environment, to be able to do the work that they needed and to have the space that they need to do the work that they wanted to do without being listened to by the people that they were living with. So for some people, that meant that they were doing Zoom calls in their bathroom, or one of our clients went into her closet for many different sessions, because that was a space that people were not going to try to necessarily come into or couldn't hear her from. We have a couple of groups specifically for clients who are survivors or victims of relationship violence. One is a Seeking Safety group, which is a trauma-based group that meets twice a week. We have a group that's called Relationships Group. And then we also have a group called Identity Group. I think that, rebuilding identity or building identity for some of our younger clients is such a vital part of the recovery process. And in Identity Group, they're able to do that for themselves and in conjunction with other people who are also struggling with the same exact issues. So there's a lot less shame and isolation in the process when you have other people to do it with. Skills-based groups like DBT skills, communication groups have been hugely impactful for people on the other end of the curve in trying to now establish newer relationships in their life, healthy relationships in their lives, and learning how to find their voice and how to find their assertive voice. Also, family services have been really, really key right now. We've always, for every single client that comes in, we do weekly parent coaching. During COVID-19, we've found that many of our parents need daily check-ins as well, because it can be very easy for them to fall into old patterns and old behaviors with their young adult children who have not been living at home for 3, 4, 5 years and who are now back in the home. And we want to make sure that just because they're living back in the home, that doesn't mean that you now start treating your 25-year-old young adult client as if they are 14 or 13 in 7th grade and 8th grade. They still need to have their own independence, their own space, their own autonomy. And parents in this time have really struggled with that. I think another population, and I think Jessica also mentioned this as well, is our LGBTQ plus population going home to non-affirming situations, to non-affirming parents. What we're seeing is some clients are so desperate to not want to go home to their parents' household that they're actually opting to shelter in place during COVID-19 in relationships that are equally as non-affirming or potentially emotionally or physically violent as well. I'm going to turn things over at this point to Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit more about specific things that people can do during this time for safety planning.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you to Jessica too. I just wanted to add my gratitude to the amount of information that you gave us during just the short amount of time that we have. So just to follow up, I think Jessica spoke to the importance of co-creating a safety plan with the survivor that you're working with. And what we need to do is just get really creative around how to be able to do this with the limitations that we have during this pandemic. So we really need to think about what are some maybe outside of the box thinking. We need to not be just relying on what we've done in the past, because sometimes those things don't work. We want to be able to think about with a potential harmful person in the house, is it about more often, because maybe they're not going off to work, how can you create some space within the house, the apartment, or a nearby space to be able to find some kind of safety. Safety planning should usually include addressing physical safety, space to be. It needs to include financial plans and important documents so that people can grab and go when they have a moment's notice, if that's what's necessary in that moment. And of course, this has to be planned ahead, because we never really know when those moments can present themselves. So being able to keep money, ID, other kind of important documents, as well as other things in a space to grab and go can be really, really key to being able to really take advantage of any moment of readiness of the survivor, but also moment of accessing safety. We talked, Jessica mentioned this, about creating some code words or code signs, both with providers, therapists, or other folks who are working with the survivor and their family, as well as children, to be able to say, this is, when I say this, or when I give you this sign, this is the time we are going to enact our safety plan. And that can include other supporters as well, neighbors, other folks who might be able to provide things like transportation and that sort of thing. You know, in the process of surviving this type of violence, it sounds a little hard to understand, but it is really important to take care of self-care while also surviving a really hostile environment or a really unsafe environment. And so, you know, it's as important to think about a safety plan is to think about self-care and how survivors can take care of themselves and create any kind of space that's possible to take care of their emotional well-being in the midst of an emotionally unsafe environment. So there can be things, when possible, to take a walk. And that has been one of the things that I think we've been able to hold on to safely during the pandemic, of knowing that you could, you know, take the dog out for a walk. We have a client that we work with at the dorm in DC who has a dog, and that's where she really is able to find some space from a family situation that is unhealthy. So thank goodness for animals to have an excuse, and that can be like one of those approved activities that Jessica was talking about. We can do some grounding and breath work anywhere we are. And so that one of the things that I think is so powerful around breath work is that sometimes with a few deep breaths can be done in total privacy or total you know, anonymity, because you can really take that with you anywhere that you go. So taking a few deep breaths, maybe doing some guided visualizations around finding a place of peace or grounding can be really helpful in preparation and practicing that in sessions with clients. We really encourage people to check in with people and make plans for check-ins, and then create as much structure and routine as best as possible throughout this experience. That's one of the things that we've said over and over again around finding success in taking care of ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, is that trying to stick with routines, trying to stick with structure can really be something that can keep us as grounded and taking care of just our physical well-being, sleeping, eating as much as we possibly can, so that we have a fighting chance to be able to have some emotional well-being as well. How can helpers help survivors in this moment? And, you know, Jessica was really clear to talk about the reasons why it's so important to let the client take the lead in this planning, or survivor. That, you know, there are patterns that are re-ingrained or reinforced all of the time about the survivor not being in control or not having autonomy in the situation. So this is a really important time to be able to say, actually, we are going to let the survivor take the lead and be client-centered in this way. We also already talked about how we need to be creative in finding ways to check in about safety. And in one way, actually, this living on Zoom and having more access to FaceTime or Zoom calls and things like that can actually give us a little bit of a window into the home environment and the environment that the survivor that we're working with is living in. And so in one way, it can be kind of a nice opportunity to just get a little bit more information, even without words, about the environment or the spaces that we can utilize that are either risky or maybe a safe space for our clients. And I do think that getting really concrete and talking with a survivor about really the basics, about what are the steps that they are able to take right now, that they're willing to take, that they want to take, to create that safety plan and to be able to focus on the fundamentals of self-care, because there's a lot out of our control in this environment. So is there anything that people are able to control? around, really just kind of fueling themselves, whether it's getting a few good meals in their system every single day, identifying times to create some space for some self-care, trying to get some sleep, that sort of thing. And then I think, the really important piece is, what are we doing as helping professionals in this pandemic, but also just in general, to be able to support the survivors that we work with and to be able to address these needs that are really challenging. And, I think the pandemic has stretched us all so far beyond our comfort zone. I don't know that anybody obviously would have asked for something like this to be lived through. But that, in one way, one of the silver linings is really being able to say, we've had to recreate some of our systems in a way we would have never really imagined ourselves. For instance, I always thought, as a therapist, I wouldn't be the kind of person that would work from home. And now here we are. I'm standing in my home right now because we've been, needing to shelter in place and be able to re-envision our field. So what I think this pandemic has done is highlight some of the challenges that we have when it comes to how our systems are taking for granted some of the things that we now know we can't take for granted, but it's also forced us to become really creative in how we meet our clients. So I'm really curious to see, once we go back into an ability to work with our clients more in person or more kind of traditionally like we have, what lessons can we bring from this pandemic to change the script, to be able to make adjustments. So I do think that we need to integrate more advanced virtual options for our clients, even when we don't need them because of the pandemic. There might need to be more options for texting and chat in 24-hour hotlines, to be able to send text messages as opposed to having to call a 1-800 number. Which there's some movement in that area, but I think there's some further steps that we can take as an industry. And then, really, Jessica mentioned this too, about the surveillance of technology and being aware and sensitive to some of the controlling and unsafe patterns that get in that people who do harm to their loved ones can get into around monitoring their locations and other kinds of activities on electronic platforms. And so we need to think through as a field, how can we meet the needs of our survivors, but also keep in mind that we're not opening them up to potentially more harm by creating something that can be tracked or hacked into in some ways. And then really, one of the things that I know to be so true is that the survivors that we work with are the ones who are teaching us so much about where we can engage safely, and really empowering them to have ideas and collaborate with us about, what would be a safe space, what would be, a place to be able to meet up if possible. What are some of those approved kind of activities where we might be able to connect with them. And I think thank you. Thank you. I was just going to say, I think that we have a long way to go to really, truly build this collaborative relationship and really trust the survivors that we're working with to allow them to take the lead, which also just increases the creativity of how we can meet their needs as well. So really appreciate Jessica speaking to that